Welcome to the 10th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, Minorities Serving in a Segregated Armed Forces. The African Americans who served on the USS Mason had already endured 90-mile-per-hour winds, 60-foot waves, and a split deck as they shepherded convoys to safety in the Atlantic when their new replacement captain arrived on board, claiming the African American sailors he led smelled, couldn't swim, and were hard to educate. First Lieutenant Vernon Baker, also an African American, destroyed 6 machine gun nests, 2 observer posts, and 4 dugouts at Castle Aghinolfi in Italy, only to see his white commanding officer, who fled the fight, receive the Silver Star. An illegal immigrant to the U.S., Jose Lopez, a Mexican American, saved his company at the Battle of the Bulge by single-handedly taking out over 100 German soldiers with his machine gun fire. Iva Ikuko Toguri, a Japanese American who had the misfortune of being in Japan when the war broke out, found herself accused of being a traitor, even as she tried her best to help American troops in an enemy land. Ira Hayes, a Native American, raised the American flag at Iwo Jima, but afterwards could not dispel the terrible combat memories that haunted him. Hattie Brantley joined the Army Nurse Corps to see the world, but was instead imprisoned under the harshest conditions in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in the Philippines for almost the duration of the war. There's stories and more in this 10th podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes Forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes that I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in their reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught. So to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes and launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. The armed forces were completely segregated during World War II, as was much of the country. During World War II, Jim Crow permeated every aspect of the U.S. In the South, blacks could not eat in the same restaurants their German POWs did. They couldn't even use the same latrines as whites and German POWs. Even the blood supply was segregated. Blacks served in segregated divisions, primarily in combat support positions, cooks, quartermasters, delivering supplies, and grave-digging duties. Although they were often relegated to menial positions such as these, 1.2 million African Americans served with distinction during World War II, and their service helped not only to win the war, but also to accelerate the civil rights movement in the war's aftermath. In the Navy, African Americans were relegated to serving in roles such as a cook or steward. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt helped to change that when she and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People urged her husband, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in 1944 to commission the USS Mason, a destroyer, and the USS PC-1264, a submarine chaser, as the only 2 World War II naval ships with predominantly African American crews. We had 144 blacks and about 40 whites on board, recalled James W. Graham of Roosevelt, New York, in a winter 1997 edition of The Bridge, a naval recruiting publication. Black sailors filled all the ratings and later some of the officer positions. "This was the first ship in history that had black guys serving as radio men, quartermasters, and signalmen," recalled Graham, who served as a radio man second class on the USS Mason and eventually became chairman of the association commemorating the USS Mason service. Lorenzo Dufault of New York City, New York, served as signalman on the USS Mason and understood that he and his fellow crew were making history. "Our battle was on two fronts at the time, prejudice and the enemy of democracy. We were the first to gain rates other than stewards, mates, and cooks. The black man had been denied the privilege of serving to his full capacity because of prejudice." At a time when segregation ruled most of the U.S., the USS Mason was fully integrated, with blacks sleeping alongside whites in the bunks and dining together in the mess hall. While aware of the historic significance of the Mason, its commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander William Blackford of Seattle, Washington, saw his ship as just another destroyer and not as an experiment. "I'm no crusader," Captain Blackford said. "I'm not out there to solve the race problem. I'm simply trying to run a good naval ship." But like it or not, the black crew of the USS Mason were continuously under a microscope, especially when an admiral was sent out to observe them. Dufault said the black crew was keenly aware that if we fouled up, it would be a mark against the entire race. However, in 10 Atlantic crossings between 1944 and 1945, the Mason served with distinction, protecting convoys of ships by dropping depth charges on enemy submarines. The USS Mason's tensest moments were not, however, caused by enemy submarines, but by a fierce hurricane it encountered in the North Atlantic while escorting a convoy of tugboats and barges. Dufault recalled the storm in a 1997 interview in the South Shore Record. "The winds were 90 miles an hour, with waves 60 feet high. One minute we'd be on the top of a wave, then we'd be at the bottom. The storm was so powerful, fear went right out of me. I put my hand in the man's, and I thought, if I survive this, I'll live forever." The tugboats were no match for the hurricane, and 20 of the crew drowned. However, the USS Mason shepherded most of the convoy to safety, then returned into the storm to rescue the scattered ships that remained. The Mason steadfastly protected its convoy, despite a crack that had begun to split its deck. "We welded it, and we kept moving," Dufault recalled. Afterwards, the officers told the men they would receive a letter of commendation for their valor, but prejudice at the time prevented any such recognition. Dufault and the men of the Mason were fiercely loyal to their white captain William Blackford, who understood our plight and was a great influence in making our ship perform at its best. He treated us as men, and he demanded the best of us at all times. After the war, a second captain became commander of the USS Mason, replacing Captain Blackford. Graham told the South Shore Record this new captain did everything he could to discredit the USS Mason's achievements. "When we came on board, he tried to teach us to read and write, though most of us were high school or college graduates. He wrote a lot of negative reports about us. He said we smelled, that we couldn't swim, that we were hard to educate. He was a bad captain. He rammed another ship, and he hit a submarine." The USS Mason was decommissioned in October of 1945 and was scrapped 2 years later. President Clinton, recognizing the surviving 67 crew members of the USS Mason in 1994, finally awarding them the commendations they'd been promised all those years ago. 10 years later, the Navy further honored the history-making crew when it commissioned a new USS Mason in 2004 and deployed it in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Dufault and a few other surviving crew members of the World War II USS Mason traveled to Port Canaveral, Florida for the commissioning. Dufault became friends with the new warship's crew and visited them whenever he could. The men of the USS Mason were proud of their achievements during the war on both fronts, in the sea against the Axis and in breaking the barriers of racial prejudice. Reflecting on the role the USS Mason played in integrating the armed forces, Dufault wrote in his letter to the author, "The purpose of life is to make it better for the next generation. We showed it can be done. Look at the Navy now. I'm 77 years old. I played a role, and I feel good about it. I don't have a lot of money, but I have a lot of pride." More than 50 years after his courageous service, First Lieutenant Vernon J. Baker of St. Mary's, Idaho, became the only living African-American World War II soldier to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Baker had been a platoon leader with Company C of the 370th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Division, when his platoon came under a heavy artillery barrage during the pre-dawn hours of April 5, 1945, on Hill X of a German mountain stronghold at Castle Aghinolfi in Italy. In a September 18, 1997 letter, Baker recalled the ominous setting of the battle. "The action took place on the high ground above the towns of Vira Racea and Montenosi on the 5th and 6th of April 1945. The castle commanded the high ground overlooking the plain of the canal, which was the line of demarcation on the front lines separating Allied forces and the German army along the Gothic line. As Baker's platoon came within 250 yards of the castle, he spotted a telescope sticking out of a bunker slit. Baker quickly pointed his M1 into the slit and emptied it, killing the 2 German soldiers inside the bunker. Baker soon found a camouflage machine gun nest, and he killed the 2 Germans manning it. When Baker found his company commander, Captain John Runyon, a German, threw a hand grenade at them both. Fortunately for Baker and Runyon, the grenade was a dud, and it bounced off Runyon's helmet. The German who threw it wasn't as fortunate. Baker shot and killed him. Before he was done, Baker would blast open another German hideout with his hand grenade and kill the 2 Germans inside it with a submachine gun. Despite Baker's heroics, his platoon was getting chewed up by the German artillery. Nonetheless, Baker was shocked when Captain Runyon ordered the troops to withdraw and told Baker that he was going to get reinforcements himself. Half a century later, Baker still didn't mince words when he recalled Runyon's actions. "First, commanding officers do not abandon their command on the field of battle to go for reinforcements. A move of that sort is designated to a trusted subordinate. A commanding officer's job is to stay in command. That is why he is given a command. My feelings were, and I make no apologies for them, that Captain Runyon was a cowardly son of a bitch, and myself and my comrades would stick it out until we were supplied with reinforcements, or we were dead, because at that time we were heady with a sense of accomplishment in that we had taken ground that had been denied to larger forces for months. We did not want to retreat." Baker didn't see or hear from Captain Runyon again until July 4, 1945, at Viareggio, Italy, when Runyon, who was white, was inexplicably decorated with a silver star. Baker himself was given the Distinguished Silver Star, but never spoke to his former commander. By the time Baker got down to the bottom of the hill and vomited, Only 7 of his 25-man platoon still survived. But they had killed 26 Germans, destroyed 6 machine gun nests, 2 observer posts, and 4 dugouts. Baker couldn't believe he had survived it all.
I was not injured in that battle, and to this day I cannot understand why I was not. As men were being blown to bits and shot to death on either side of me, adrenaline was pumping full force.
Baker was one of 1.2 million African Americans who served in World War II. Despite their numbers and the valor of their service, none were awarded the nation's top military honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor. Only 9 African American soldiers received the second highest award, the Distinguished Service Cross. In 1995, the Pentagon asked military scholars from Shaw University in North Carolina to research why African Americans had been excluded from the nation's highest military honors during their service in World War II. Shaw University's 1997 report concluded, while there is no official documentation for racial prejudice in the awards process for the Medal of Honor, this study concludes that the failure of an African American soldier to win a Medal of Honor most definitely lay in the racial climate and practice of the Army in World War II. Seeking to rectify the wrong, President Bill Clinton awarded 7 black World War II soldiers the Medal of Honor in the 1990s after a Special Army Senior Officer Awards Board had certified their heroic actions met the rigorous standards. All but 1 of the 6 recipients were given the Medal of Honor posthumously. Only First Lieutenant Vernon J. Baker of St. Mary's, Idaho, lived to receive his Medal of Honor in person. For Baker, it was a moment of vindication, not just for himself, but for all African Americans who had served their country with valor. In his letter, Baker wrote that his recognition was a sign that the U.S. was making progress towards racial equality, even if it still had a long way to go.
Yes, we have a long way to go before we are really together, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that light is getting brighter.
It was the brave service of African Americans in companies like Vernon Baker and the crew of the USS Mason that became the stimulus for President Truman to integrate the armed forces completely in 1948 and paved the way for Colin Powell to one day become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. An estimated 500,000 Mexican Americans served in World War II. They were twice as likely to be born in the U.S. as Mexico. Most Mexican Americans were eager to serve and to finally feel like they were being recognized as true Americans. With the exception of the 65th Infantry Regiment from Puerto Rico, Hispanic Americans were not segregated into separate units as African Americans were. Jose M. Lopez had been born in Santiago, Wheatland, Mexico, but came to the U.S. illegally as a 13-year-old and falsified his birth certificate so he could join the Marines and serve his adopted country. On December 17, 1944, Lopez was near Krinkelt, Belgium, when he heard German tanks and infantry coming and feared they would soon overrun his company.
I had 5 boxes of ammunition at the Battle of the Bulge. Someone helped me carry the 5 boxes of ammunition. My job was to guard the Road Valley while my company rested at the foot of the forest. Captain McDonald was in command. I was in my foxhole several hours, approximately 3 to 5 hours. I was cold, and I was tired. I heard the German tanks coming in the distance. I had to decide when to start shooting my machine gun. When I saw the German troops, I started firing my machine gun single-handedly. The tank was searching for me, and it started shooting its shells towards me. One shell hit so close that I was thrown backward out of the foxhole. After a little while, I got my machine gun again. I got back in the foxhole, and I started shooting again. I stopped only after my supply of ammunition was exhausted.
While firing his machine gun, Lopez kept changing positions and praying to the Virgin of Guadalupe that his life would be spared.
The tank also continued with his aim at me during my firing, plus the German soldiers were advancing. I estimate the time that I was shooting at the Germans was about 45 minutes. I was now out of ammunition, and I decided to retreat. I picked up my machine gun, and I went looking for my company. The next day, my company commander went back to see what I did for my unit. They counted more than 100 Germans dead. The next thing I knew, I was being recommended for the Medal of Honor. My friends, well, they were very happy that I saved their lives, because they knew they would not be alive today if I had not fired my machine gun.
Lopez received the Congressional Medal of Honor from President Truman on June 18, 1945. His citation noted that Lopez was almost solely responsible for allowing Company K to avoid being enveloped, to withdraw successfully, and to give other forces coming up the support time needed to build a line which repelled the enemy drive. Lopez was one of 11 Mexican Americans to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. Like African Americans, many Mexican Americans returned home to find their heroism was not appreciated, and their racism they thought they were defeating in Nazi Germany still existed in American society. When the governor of Arizona declared August 14, 1945, Sylvester Herrera Day in honor of Herrera receiving the Medal of Honor, the governor had to order Phoenix businesses to take down signs that read, "No Mexican Trade Wanted." Worse yet, when the widow of Private Felix Longoria of Three Rivers, Texas, received his remains 4 years after he died in combat in the Philippines, the local funeral home denied his widow the use of the chapel for the wake. The funeral home director explained,
"We just never made it a practice to let Mexican Americans use the chapel, and we aren't going to let them start now."
Nearly 60,000 Asian Americans served in World War II. Over half, 33,000, were Japanese Americans. At first barred from military service, Japanese Americans were allowed to enlist starting in January 1943. Many sought to prove their loyalty and to escape the terrible living conditions imposed on them in the Japanese internment camps the U.S. government had forced them to relocate to. Deemed a threat to national security without any evidence supporting it, 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated in concentration camps. Forced to abandon their homes and property, these Japanese Americans were herded into army barracks, offering little privacy from other families, surrounded by guard towers and barbed wire. It is estimated that incarcerated Japanese Americans lost nearly $400 million in property during their imprisonment. It wasn't until 1988 that the U.S. government finally apologized for the forced relocation and imprisonment of Japanese Americans. Each living Japanese American concentration camp survivor was given a paltry $20,000 by the U.S. government as reparations. The racial prejudice and wartime hysteria endured by Japanese Americans in the war remains a stain in American history. Accused of being disloyal, their homes and property stolen, their freedom stolen, Japanese Americans endured many hardships during World War II, but perhaps no Japanese American suffered as many indignities as Iva Ikuko Toguri, better known as Tokyo Rose. Tokyo Rose was a nickname American GIs created for all the women heard on Japanese propaganda radio broadcasts. The most famous of those women was Iva Ikuko Toguri, a Japanese American who had the misfortune of visiting Japan when the war broke out. Forced to either work in a munitions factory or to broadcast to American troops on the radio, she chose the latter. Toguri made a total of 340 broadcasts of the 0 Hour, a 15-minute radio broadcast containing news, music, and propaganda. Although entertaining, the broadcasts were intended by the Japanese to break the spirit of the fighting troops with their suggestions that their wives and girlfriends were cheating on them back home. Toguri herself refused to ever read anything over the air that was critical of the United States. The broadcasts themselves, written by American and Australian POWs, often cleverly mocked the Japanese imperial government, which didn't understand the nuanced double entendres. Throughout her time as Tokyo Ro, Toguri remained loyal to the U.S. Toguri even used her meager $7 monthly paychecks to buy food, which she smuggled to American POWs interred in the Japanese camps. Despite the protests of other POWs that Toguri had done nothing wrong, and the documented evidence that she regularly smuggled food to prisoners of war, after the war Toguri was charged with treason and sentenced to 10 years in prison by the U.S. government. While she was incarcerated, Toguri remained patriotic and was remembered by her fellow prisoners for always standing at attention during the national anthem. Eventually, President Gerald Ford pardoned Toguri in 1977 when it was discovered that the witnesses against her in her trial had been forced to commit perjury. Toguri could easily have been bitter. The U.S. citizenship she had refused to revoke under pressure by the Japanese was stripped from her by her own government. Her Portuguese husband and daughter were refused entrance to the U.S. Her daughter later died as a result of the desperate conditions of post-war Japan. While in prison, Toguri was denied repeated requests to see her dying mother. And, on top of her long imprisonment, Toguri was forced to pay the Justice Department a large fine. Despite all that, Toguri never wavered. Her father later told her,
"You were like a tiger. You never changed your stripes. You stayed American through and through."
Toguri lived just long enough for the World War II Veterans Committee to bestow her with a Citizenship Award in her 89th year for her love of country and the courage she showed her fellow Americans, despite being persecuted by first the Japanese and then her own U.S. country. Eager to protect their country and ancestral homelands, 44,000 Native Americans enlisted in World War II, approximately 10% of the U.S. Native American population. Native Americans made up 1/5 of the 45th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Thunderbirds, who liberated Dachau concentration camp alongside the 42nd Infantry Division. The U.S. used Native American languages to develop secret battle communications. The Axis never deciphered the Cold War code talkers' messages. Perhaps no Native American service member is better remembered than Corporal Ira Hayes, one of the 6 servicemen who raised the American flag at the Battle of Iwo Jima. In just 1 month, the Battle of Iwo Jima, referred to by GIs as a meat grinder, had cost 6,821 American lives and some 18,000 wounded. The losses for the Japanese had been far worse. Of General Kiribashi's 21,000 soldiers, all but 216 were killed. After 4 days of intense fighting, Mount Suribachi was captured, and the American flag was raised on its summit, not once, but twice. After 3 days of intense fighting, backed by naval and air bombardments, First Lieutenant Harold Shire volunteered to lead a platoon of 40 Marines to the summit of Mount Suribachi, where they raised the U.S. flag at 10:20 a.m. on February 23rd, to the cheers of the Marines locked in deadly battle with the Japanese machine gunners and snipers below. The flag buoyed not only the spirits of the Marines, but also of the naval men whose bombardments had provided them with cover. The big American ships sounded their whistles upon seeing the stars and stripes. A second, larger flag was raised 3 hours later after word had come to a 2nd Battalion Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, Shire's commanding officer, that the U.S. Secretary of Navy intended to have the first flag lowered and given to him as a souvenir.
"To hell with that,"
Johnson declared. His Marines had sacrificed much in Iwo Jima's meat grinder, and the flag represented their sacrifice. It belonged to the battalion. Johnson ordered it taken down, secured, and replaced with a larger flag. It was the hoisting of the larger flag, 3 hours later, that was captured in the famous picture by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal. Rosenthal's picture, which later became the inspiration for the U.S. Marine Corps War Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, also captured the immense price both sides paid for at Iwo Jima. 3 of the 6 men who raised the second flag that day would lose their lives on Iwo Jima just days or weeks after the picture was taken. Of the 3 men who survived, one man, Native American Ira Hayes, was haunted by the fact that he was but one of 5 men in his platoon of 45 who had survived the battle, and one of 27 survivors in his company of 250. Hayes was welcomed home as a war hero. He went across the country selling war bonds and even played himself in the John Wayne movie Sands of Iwo Jima. Visitors and letters of appreciation flooded the quiet reservation where he lived. But Hayes could not accept his celebrity status, especially knowing that so many of his friends still lay in the ground at Iwo Jima. He commented,
"They were better men than me, and they're not coming back, much less back to the White House, like me."
About the famous Rosenthal picture, Hayes said,
"Sometimes I wish the guy had never made that picture."
Unable to return to the anonymous life he had once had on the reservation, Hayes died 3 months after President Eisenhower unveiled the celebrated War Memorial. After a night of heavy drinking, mourning the good buddies he lost, Hayes died a haunted man, still trapped on Iwo Jima's bloody beaches. 350,000 women served in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, both at home and abroad. General George C. Marshall and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt were both advocates of women serving in the military. In the Women's Army Corps, women served in more than 200 non-combatant roles in every theater of war. The 1,000 women in the Women's Air Force Service pilots flew planes from factories to bases, transported cargo, simulated strafing and targeting missions, and flew more than 60 million miles. Ferried planes from factories to bases, transporting cargo, and participating in simulation and target missions. About 74,000 women served in the United States Army and Navy Nurse Corps during World War II, of which Hattie Brantley was one. Brantley was not the least bit concerned about war when she arrived to her new posting, fulfilling a dream to be a nurse at Fort McKinley Station Hospital in the Philippines. Brantley accepted her station to the Philippines in the summer of 1941 with great happiness, not knowing the cruel fate that awaited her. "I wanted to be in the Army so I could see the world. As nurses, we're assigned to Hawaii and the Philippines and Puerto Rico. We had hospitals in these areas, but none in Europe until after World War II began," Brantley wrote. Arriving in Luzon, Brantley found the lush mountains, beautiful coastline, and heavenly beaches to be a paradise. Her assignment seemed easy, even laid back. She worked a split schedule from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and again from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. each day in the small station hospital. In between, she enjoyed plenty of leisure time, playing golf, swimming, and shopping in downtown Manila. Although most dependents had been sent back to the U.S. by Thanksgiving, Luzon's tranquility made war seem like an impossibility to Brantley.
Shock is hardly the word when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and we, in the Philippines, we were tossed into war just as suddenly,
Brantley recalled. Because they were across the international date line, news of Pearl Harbor's devastation did not reach Fort McKinley Station until Monday morning, when Brantley and the other nurses went to breakfast and heard the first reports over the radio. The head nurse quickly reassured her medical team, telling them there wasn't anything to worry about and that they would not be bothered in Luzon by the Japanese. Later that evening, as shots rang out in the jungle, the nurses decided they did indeed have something to worry about.
"We had no idea what to do,"
Brantley said in an interview with Soldier magazine in September 1989.
"So the four of us, well, we hid under a bungalow."
By noon the next day, Clark Air Force Base was under attack, the Japanese destroying most of the bombers whose crews were at lunch. The decision was made to move the hospital from Fort McKinley to Manila. Although public buildings were converted into a 300-bed hospital, no patients were received before the medical staff was again ordered to move, this time to the Bataan Peninsula.
"We moved in open buses on the early morning of Christmas Eve," Brantley told Soldier magazine, "and all along the way we had to stop. We had to get out and we had to lie in ditches because of the bombers."
When the nurses arrived at the field site, they found that nothing was set up. They went to work creating 17 wards with approximately 35 beds in each. The wounded began arriving, crowding the tiny field hospital number 1 before work was even done setting it up. Brantley found that the easy nights at Fort McKinley were gone for good, as the nurses began working from sunup to sundown, treating the never-ending flow of casualties. Although there was no shortage of casualties, there was a shortage, however, of supplies. Brantley and the other nurses knew that the stranglehold the Japanese had on Americans in the peninsula meant that no further supplies would be forthcoming when the little they had ran out. Still, the wounded took it in stride as best they could. Hatley recalled one badly injured soldier who seemed more concerned about her than he did his own life-threatening injuries.
"I remember this sweet boy from the Midwest who had lost all 4 of his limbs. I stopped by as often as I could. Once, after a quiet talk, he said, 'What's a nice girl like you doing in a situation like this? You shouldn't be undergoing these hardships.' Can you imagine? He said that to me."
The Americans could delay the Japanese advance, but they couldn't stop it, and were pushed farther and farther south, until by April orders came from the hospital commander to move the nurses and as many soldiers as they could to the tunnels of Corregidor Island, aptly called the Rock, at the mouth of Manila Bay. Then, on April 9th, General E.P. King, in command of American and Filipino forces on the island of Luzon, issued an unconditional surrender of the 76,000 troops, 12,000 of them Americans, remaining on Bataan. The next day the prisoners were herded together and the 200-mile march towards San Fernando began. Starvation, exposure, exhaustion, dysentery would claim thousands of American POWs, many of whom were butchered by the Japanese when they finally collapsed of exhaustion. Before it was over, some 900 Americans would lose their lives in what became known as the Bataan Death March. Almost simultaneously, the Japanese turned their sights to the tiny garrison at Corregidor, aiming their artillery and sending their bombers to attack it from the air. Holed up in the tunnels at Corregidor, the situation became increasingly dire for Brantley and the thousands of others taking refuge there. In 1989, Brantley recalled the desperate conditions in Soldier magazine.
It was hot and smelly, and we had more than 1,000 patients. With so many people living so close together, nothing was adequate. The food was worse than... Well, by this time somebody found a supply of cracked wheat that had been stored in the tunnels in 25-pound bags since 1918. I'm not saying it was edible, but we ate it, and we ate the worm larva that floated to the top of the cereal because it was protein. The people who did not survive would not eat what we had.
On May 5th, after an intensive air and artillery bombardment, Japanese soldiers landed on Corregidor and forced the surrender of General Wainwright unconditionally the following day to General Masaharu Homa. The Japanese captured the Malinta Tunnel, but did not move the Americans there for another 6 weeks. By the time they finally were moved by ship from the tunnels of Corregidor to Manila's Santo Tomas internment camp, Brantley was so weak from a 105-degree fever, a result of tropical infectious disease, that she was unable to recall much of what happened. For nearly 3 years, the internment camp would become home to Brantley and several thousand Allied civilians who had been living in Manila prior to the war's outbreak. During the 32 months of her captivity, Brantley said that mail was never received, and Red Cross packages were allowed in the camp only on 3 occasions. Even in the midst of their captivity and desperate conditions, Brantley recalled in her letter that the nurses never stopped caring for their fellow prisoners of war.
We nurses provided the nursing care for the civilian group, this without enough medicine or other amenities of patient care. The diet was always inadequate. Cornmeal mush, coconut milk watered down, and dirty rice and soup gravy without protein. Tropical diseases were common, and we treated surgical requirements as professionally as possible with the available doctors. The medical staff consisted of older physicians who had been living in Manila working for various companies, and a few missionary doctors from China.
Everyone at the camp knew hunger, and the internees existed on the meager rice rations and the tiny gardens that they were allowed to tend. Brantley recalled the struggle to survive.
Outside vendors were allowed in camp with fruits and local vegetables, but most people did not have any money to purchase them. How we existed and survived the almost 3 years is due to the grace of God and the ingenuity of those in charge, begging, borrowing, cajoling to get food for the internees.
On February 3rd, 1945, the 1st Cavalry Division made a mad 114-mile dash in just 60 hours from the Lingayen Gulf to the outskirts of Manila to rescue the 4,000 internees at Santo Tomas. In the firefight that followed, several internees were killed before the Japanese garrison was overwhelmed.
God had his hand on the group, and all the nurses survived. A total of 67 Army nurses and 12 Navy nurses. We were the first group to be evacuated. We were flown out in a C-47, taking off from a city street, and we island hopped home. They gave us time to recover a bit, adjust to the idea of freedom, and by the time we got to San Francisco, a few weeks later, we looked almost human.
Despite her ordeal as a prisoner of war, Hattie Brantley decided to continue her career with the Corps, and she remained in the Army until retiring in 1969
having served for some 30 years in Germany, Italy, and all over the U.S. It was a proud Lieutenant Colonel Hattie Brantley that accepted a POW medal along with 30 other former prisoners of war on a parade field at Fort Sam Houston, Texas in 1988, the same base she retired from and where her career had begun all those years ago. For Brantley, her years of imprisonment were all a part of the service she gave willingly to a country she loved. I consider I had a great career, rare opportunities for service to my country and mankind, and I'm thankful for every single bit of it.
You'll Never Know, sometimes referred to as You'll Never Know Just How Much I Love You, was written by Harry Warren and the lyrics by Mac Gordon. The song was based on a poem written by a young Oklahoma war bride named Dorothy Fern Norris. Alice Faye introduced the song in the 1943 movie Hello Frisco Hello, and it won the Academy Award for Best Original Song that year. This version was from Dick Haymes, and it actually became a 1 million copy seller and won him a Gold Record Achievement Award. If you liked this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network that you use. Follow our podcasts. Please follow our podcasts and tell your friends. New episodes come out bi-weekly. You'll find the companion book on Amazon.com. And if you'll go to the website, you'll see pictures of each of the veterans that were featured in this podcast on the website, as well as additional information about them and the episodes that you might have missed. Until next time, thank you for remembering our World War II veterans.